systematizing. We're not systematizing things, but uh, it is nonetheless an invitation to experiment. So, but that is to each, according to each of us and our own needs. As I found it always part of the freedom that Krishnamurti put forward, that what he said was not to be taken literally, he wasn't to be accepted, and that it was to be found out. Truth, as he used to say, cannot be handed over, cannot be given by another. It has to be discovered. If one is quick enough to see the truth when somebody else is saying it, so much the better. But otherwise, one just has to continuously maintain a level of attention that brings it about, has that quality of discovery. So, in talking to some friends this morning, in a dialogue that we have every Sunday, they were talking about also this quality of perception and what does it mean to see? What does it mean to perceive? Because the way I read Krishnamurti, and particularly the notebook, is talk so much about what it means to perceive. And in many ways, is all our lives are dependent on perception. They're built of perceptions. And of course, the perception makes up a concept. The concept then influences how we see the world, and it goes around like that. Krishnamurti was concerned that the perceptions that we have at the moment, the way we see, is actually distorted. We don't really see. We don't really perceive. With my kids, we watch some of the little films about Sherlock Holmes. They came up with a Sherlock Holmes series, you see. And Sherlock Holmes is a great observer, right? And he can deduce any number of things from just looking at the person and the clothes they wear. He was that quick. And he had his friend, of course, Dr. Watson, who was a bit duller than he was. And he used to say to him, Watson, you see, but you do not perceive. So this is the question. See, we see, we look, but we do not perceive. And the question is, can we be sharp? Sherlock Holmes style in relation to our own lives and relations. So that is what Krishnamurti is talking about. And of course, the notebook is fundamentally his showing to what depth that perception can go. Perception that's not even him involved in the picture. It's a perception that goes beyond thought, that goes beyond consciousness as we know it. Now that we don't know, only occasionally are we there. That's why it's difficult to talk about it, because he's talking already at a level of the perception has gone through, right? There's been this choiceless awareness of the movement of daily life. That is part of meditation. But as he goes, it sort of, thought itself fades out of the picture. Thought dwells on misperception. It's very strange. How is thought sustained? This is the question. How does thought sustain itself in its movement when, as we said in the meditation, you discover, for example, that it's just a wave on the surface of reality, and that there is a deeper reality. I call it reality because I don't know what else to call it, but let's say a non-dual level of existence versus this one of me here and you there. There's always the observer and the observed. So that he comes to the point at which the perception itself sees that the observer is actually not perceiving at all, is a conception, a thought that is projected onto the object, and that's what we see. So that's not seeing. See, all these racial prejudices, all this conditioning from different backgrounds are projections of thought, and that is the reality we see, and then we say that is what is there, right? So the label conditions the mind to misperceive. The thought is already a conclusion, and therefore we don't actually touch the actuality. And that's why how we miss one another culturally, psychologically, in all kinds of ways. The relationships are destroyed, and in a violent way on a daily basis because of this projection and this misperception that comes from conclusions from the past. So this becomes a major responsibility. I sometimes, Krishnamurti used to say, look, psychologically, we are dead entities. And that's why we spread death all around us, because we don't know what else to do. We destroy life because we insist on having it conform to the pattern of the dead past. I thought that was, poetically, one has to go into it, one cannot accept. It's very poetic. But I think there is some truth, and maybe even a deep truth in that. If I am dead as a psychological entity because I dwell in identifications with the past, and what else can I identify with? If not, that's also a question. What can form an identity if it's not based upon a history? Is there an identity that has no history? And is history a living thing? Or, in order for life to be full, that history has to be put aside, set aside entirely. Now, he says that's death. Psychologically, to die to the past, he talks this way. Now, I used to think, well, death is something else. And when you bring it in that thing, it's kind of frightening, because death is kind of a denial of life. But he brings it in as, in fact, the necessary ending of that which is already dead in order for life to be. Sounds paradoxical? Maybe? But it is a beautiful thing to see that my past, as my personality, being dead and being the operating system of consciousness, the way I look at the world, the way reality is constructed, is what fragments it, is what destroys it, is what doesn't allow me to live, because it doesn't allow me to relate. And life is relationship. I always found that it's a very simple sentence from Kay, but I think it's profoundly significant that life is relationship, is the interconnectedness with the other, not this continuous separation which that past brings about. So in order to live, in order to really be helpful to one another, in order to discover all those good things that we are after, beauty, love, truth, goodness, you name it, this past is actually the one that needs to see itself for the dead entity it is and how irrelevant it is, and in the act of meeting life fully. You used to talk like that, right? Do you meet life? Can you meet life? Can you be? It's not even meeting. Is can you be life? Can you be alive? Are you alive? It's even a funny question to ask, no? We always say, well, I am alive. But maybe the I is the center, is a dead center. Now that's a tremendous question that Krishnamurti posed through in the works of consciousness. Is the I, psychologically speaking, alive? Right? It feels like it, right? I say I, of course, here I am, doing all this, moving around. I'm not just, at the moment, I'm not just a picture in a computer to myself. And so there's a feeling of aliveness. So yes, all right, there's an organism and all is alive. But is the center operating system based on memory? Is it what happened to me? And not just now, but ages past. The stream of the past is old, is older than me. Right? It's mankind itself has built an extraordinary accumulation of experience which it has distilled into the very operating structure of consciousness. So consciousness is rooted in the past as such. And maybe we need it. We need knowledge. We need science. We need all the instinctual drives to biologically sustain ourselves. And at the same time, we realize that those things are not the totality, and that wholeness, the health and sanity of the world and of our lives depends on that being put, not being the whole, not occupying, not being the focus, the outlook on life. For life goes beyond it, and we need to bring that unknown and to embody it, and therefore to die to that past in order for life to be. I think that's a beautiful, poetic way of approaching it, right? But we have to see it, of course. One thing is to say these things, and another one is to see them. But what did Krishnamurti want to do, right? He wanted, first of all, to realizing that the human condition, because of this fragmentary structure that we have put together, that leads to a quality of degeneration in every field. So he was asking the question fundamentally, can mankind regenerate itself? Can there be a regeneration? And he felt very strongly that the regeneration couldn't come from consciousness as it is. That therefore there has to be an insight into consciousness and putting it in its right place. Can consciousness regenerate itself? We have to ask that question. He thought it couldn't. That thought, because it's tied to the past, it can transcend its own borders. That it has to respond to some quality of intelligence that is beyond it. He used to talk about thought as a donkey tied to a tether. And he said the tether can be long or short, but is always operating within the radio of its knowledge. Right? A scientist can go very far in the understanding of nature, but is still tied to the rope and the stake of his knowledge. Knowledge will always be limited. The rope will always have a length, and it will have a circumference. We have a circle like that. And he's saying we come now in our civilization to the point of realizing that thought has come to the end of its tether. I find that also very poetic. Is there that realization that in our time, particularly in our time, because we've tried all kinds of experiments, we put all kinds of theories together, and they have all fallen apart, right? That's one of the experiences of modernity. There are attempts to create encompassing systems, be they religious, scientific, political, psychological, and the rest, have all shown their limitations. And in fact, when we have tried to impose them as absolutes, as all-encompassing, as dominating and controlling reality, they have produced massive disorder. So thought, we have now this question as to whether thought has come to the end of its tether, and that becomes a really profound crisis in the way of the operating of human consciousness, because it itself is at the center of the crisis. Even to say such a thing is sounds very extreme, because we are all dealing with smaller problems apparently, right? Problems of economics, problems of political relations, problems of racial relations, problems of gender relations, problems of countries, different political systems, different religious beliefs. We're still in that mess. Huh? But it's a mess. So to have to rise above and see that actually behind it there is a much deeper issue, a much more universal issue that affects us all. I think that if we were even to come to that point of realizing that it is just thought that is never able to get past its own borders, and that in fact it picks a little piece of the known and constructs it into the center of being, whereas it's just a fragment within a fragment, and therefore inadequate to encompass reality and to help us deal with life at all. So I'm not dismissing thought, by the way. There are scientists and so on working very nicely, fortunately, in all kinds of areas. But overall, the sense of coming to the end of the tether is for me a very important insight on Krishnamurti's part, and places us, of course, all of us, because we are operating from thought a lot of the time, places us all in the center of that responsibility to see whether we can see the limitation and go beyond it, because otherwise we won't be able to meet. I will always be enclosed in me, and you and yourself, right? And the idea will predominate over the fact. The what is will be hidden by the projections of thought upon it. And therefore our misconceptions, our prejudices, our falsification of our own being by thought identifying with a piece of the past. This is a tremendous thing to look at. Huh? So what he wants to see, if I understand him correctly, is whether there can be a regeneration. This is degeneration. This is the dissolution of that. So he talks about degeneration. I'll read you a little bit. How easy it is to degenerate. Apparently it is easy, is it? In every way, to let the body waste, become sluggish, fat, to allow feelings to wither away, the mind allowing itself to become shallow, petty, and dull. A clever mind is a shallow mind, and it cannot renew itself, and so withers away in its own bitterness. It decays by the exercise of its own brittle sharpness, by its own thought. Every thought shapes the mind in the mold of the known. Every thought, every feeling, every emotion, however refined, becomes wasteful and empty, and the body fed on thought and feeling loses its sensibility. We're feeding the body with thought and feeling? It is not physical energy, though it is necessary, that breaks through the wearying dullness. It is not enthusiasm or sentiment which brings about sensitivity of one's whole being. Enthusiasm and sentiment corrupt. It is thought that is the disintegrating factor, for thought has its roots in the known. A life based on thought and its activities becomes mechanical. However smoothly it may run, it is still mechanical action. Action with motive dissipates energy, and so disintegration sets in. All motives, conscious or unconscious, generate from the known. A life of the known, though projected into the future as the unknown, is decay. In that life, there is no renewal. Thought can never bring about innocency and humility, and yet it is innocency and humility that keep the mind young, sensitive, incorruptible. Freedom from the known is the ending of thought. To die to thought from moment to moment is to be free from the known. It is this death that puts an end to decay. There's a lot, so much, he just writes a paragraph. It's loaded. I mean, maybe we could spend, I think I could spend the next 10 years just meditating on a mountain on just that. It's so, do I even begin, to perceive the real deadening, decaying nature of thought, or living in the known, from the known, right? With all these motivations, right? Springing up, my desires, my needs, all that continuous streaming of intention, action, and so on, right? And yet, not being either humble or innocent. The humility we talked about yesterday, as Krishnamurti was saying, is the virtue, right? The fundamental virtue. He sort of pulled them all into one. He said, well, there are all kinds of virtues, but there's only one that really matters, encompasses them all. And that's humility. He also calls it innocence sometimes, or austerity, simplicity. He uses certain words to signify a state of mind in which the focus of identity and self-interest are not prevalent, and maybe not even present at all. As we said, humility is the absence of arrogance. is the absence of this self-interest that dominates our lives. So there is already something to consider, to begin to see how that self-interest is actually, in his words, he uses the word corrupting, decaying factor. I don't think he's being moralistic when he uses the word corruption. He uses it in the etymological sense of breaking things up. That is the etymological meaning of the word corrompere, means to break things apart. It just means fragmentation. It has a moral connotation in our language, right? Corruption, social corruption, moral corruption. But it just means breaking things down. So does thought break things down? Does operating from the known break things down? And it would seem that it does, because it itself is being a fragment, not being able to meet the totality of the present now. It fragments it. It fragments our lives, it divides, separates, because it itself cannot capture the totality. So the challenge is there a way, is there an awakening to that other dimension in which thought and the known have their place, but only as that part, limited part that they are, that it is, right? Thought and the known, knowledge that I need to go from here to there, to catch a train and use a computer and speak a language, that sort of thing is very important element, extremely important. But yet in the realm of being, this is maybe one way to put it, why is it has no importance? Because it denies being. It is what was, not what is. What is transcends it. Thought, knowledge is part of what is part of what is happening, but is not the totality. He can never encompass it. And this is the human project. We thought that by knowledge we can encompass the whole, and we find out that because it is the past, it can never do that. That's the limitation. That's the end of the tether. Now, we talked yesterday in that regard about there's no denying thought, you see. It is very easy to condemn thought. Kay, sometimes I feel he's very good at this. Every time he says something, he gets out his whip and beats thought up again another time. Thought is just the culprit for everything. The poor thing, I mean, he looks a bit sometimes like a beaten dog. Careful. We'll be a bit gentle maybe about it, right? We are using it. It's a good instrument. He uses it too. He speaks a language. He writes a book. So that's part of thought. He uses it well, and he doesn't dominate his life and he doesn't corrupt his existence. Very good. So he put it in its right place. Well, lucky the man, blessed is he to whom that quality is given. But we are there in that regard, and so maybe a little compassion for the poor beast. He's always whipping the thing. Thought is this, and thought is that, and thought is the bad guy in the movie. Well, maybe not. Maybe yes, maybe no. We have to inquire more. He has a way, though, to suggest, as we said yesterday when talking about meditation, how we can ourselves approach thought without borrowing even from Krishnamurti or from any other tradition, any condemnation of thought. Because in fact, the whole, as the way I was putting it, of course, I see it, describing it as a danger, which is probably right? I think it is correct description, but then we can already make a judgment about thought and start creating an opposition. So it is important not to create this kind of oppositions and start fixing upon thought the source of all evil, right? That may not be. We don't understand even what thought is. So we have to be also humble in our approach to thought, acknowledge our ignorance, that we don't know, right? We're being told, and we sense that this may be true, but we have to actually come into contact with it. And yesterday we were saying that that's part of meditation. That meditation at this level is not to be seen as the denial of thought. It has that dimension, and at a certain point that arises. But in the beginning, if we were to do it now, all of us sit quietly and look at our consciousness, thought would be active. So our tendency would be to deny thought. But we cannot deny thought. That's another contradiction. That's another division and judgment. So we are not going to do that, but to see. The point is to see, and to see without choice. So that's why he was talking about allowing the flowering. This is a very beautiful thing, because it liberates us, I think, from a lot of the conflict that we have with ourselves in relation to finding our wholeness. And most traditions emphasize control and judgment. And that, I think, is where they go wrong. They introduce a new factor of conflict in us, and therefore a new factor of degeneration, because our energy goes down, and it's draining us, it's making us weak and fragmented. So it's part of the corruption, see? So let's not accept that. So he said, that's why I wanted to read you this paragraph yesterday, but I couldn't find it on the spur of the moment. So I read it today, just to give you the flavor of what it might mean for us to allow thought and all these emotions to flower and to come into contact with them. After all, it's us. And it's not a matter of introducing a new division. They will disappear. That's the beauty of insight, right? When we see what is false in us and it disappears, then we're free, right? So that quality of freedom is important. But if we don't look, if we condemn, we won't even have the chance to see. So we have to give ourselves a chance to see. He says, every thought and feeling must flower for them to live and die. Flowering of everything in you, the ambition, the greed, the hate, flowering of hate, the joy, the passion. In the flowering, there is their death and freedom. They are liberated from themselves. It is only in freedom that anything can flourish, not in suppression, in control and discipline. These only pervert, corrupt, uses the verb again. Flowering and freedom is goodness and all virtue. To allow envy to flower is not easy. It is condemned or cherished, but never given freedom. It is only in freedom the fact of envy reveals its color, its shape. The feeling of envy has color and shape. Its depth, its peculiarities. He's really so poetic. If suppressed, it will not reveal itself fully and freely. Okay? When it has shown itself completely, there is an ending of it only to reveal another fact: emptiness, loneliness, fear. And as each fact is allowed to flower, in freedom, in its entirety, the conflict between the observer and the observed ceases. There is no longer the censor, but only observation, only seeing. Freedom can only be in completion, not in repetition, suppression, obedience to a pattern of thought. There is completion only in flowering and dying. There is no flowering if there is no ending. What has continuity is thought in time. The flowering of thought is the ending of thought. For only in death is there the new. The new cannot be if there is no freedom from the known. Thought, the old, cannot bring into being the new. It must die for the new to be. What flowers must come to an end. It has no future, for it has no seed. I don't know where this guy lived in a completely free sense of dimension where this rootedness and continuous seeding of thought has ceased. Because thought seeds itself, right? It continues to proliferate. We do that in our daily lives. The desires, the pains, the fears from yesterday, they proliferate. They don't cease from one day to the next. And he says, just because we don't allow them to flower to fullness and die, and therefore leave no seed. That's a very interesting metaphor, no? Is there a way in which whatever arises in consciousness and as emotion, like envy, right? Suppose I'm envious. What does it mean to allow that to flower? Does it mean give it full expression? Or is it more inwardly that the feeling itself is allowed to reveal its full content? I'm envious of that person because they have more money than I do, and they are more famous than I do, whereas I'm as intelligent as they are. Why don't I have the same money and the same fame? That sort of comparison, you see, it's comparison envy, right? You compare yourself, you find you have less, and you envy those who have more, in whichever direction you're competing, whichever field, right? So there you are. But he says, if you go through that, and you realize this comparison, and your own image and so on, you discover other facts underneath. It's like consciousness is one of these Russian dolls. When you open the outside, you find another one inside. Right? It's a bit different and more basic. He says you find your own loneliness. You find your own fear. Because obviously behind, for example, envy, and there is the fear of not being. There's the fear that by having less, you are less. And so on, right? And one is always, that's the fundamental fear we're driving us all. So to meet, he says, all right, now you open that box and you find this other one. And behind that you may find still other things. Because in fact, thought is behind the whole show. At the bottom of all those little Russian dolls, the creator of the dolls is just thinking. Okay? So we have to meet thinking. And so you see, very interesting thing to be able to, if one stays with something which seems superficial, which it isn't, it reveals depth. He used to say everything in consciousness is interrelated. Nothing is separate. If jealousy, fear, pleasure, pain, joy, well, joy may be different, but all those phenomena of thought are all interrelated. And they're all doorways. That's another way to put it, right? They're all doorways to self-discovery of the deeper layers that consciousness hides from itself. It's hiding fear of emptiness. For example, I pursue being through these things, and that's why my envy is there, because it's the way of comparative achievement, comparative measurement of my worth in the structure of society. And that's what I want. Because I don't want to be just nobody. Nobody wants to be nobody. How is that possible? And that Krishnamurti's point, right? He says, all right, watch it, see what's the motivation. And it's all coming from the known. So at the end of the story, at the root is living in the known. It has to do like this. The known, living in the known may be the root of fear. He comes to that point. Naturally. That would also be logical even, because if I live in an island of the past, I naturally fear, what do you fear? The unknown. But the unknown is life itself. I fear life. I think that's dreadful. If you bring it logically, even logically, you come to that point of realizing that one is afraid of life. In its unknowingness, in its total creative, timeless dimension, which, my little self, in its own self-protective measures, cannot, keep at bay. We do our best to generate security for ourselves psychologically and in every way, but that's impossible. And that's why maybe fear, even would go as far as to suggest, actually he stated it, I say suggest because I haven't grasped yet the depth of all this, that fear, because of the structure of consciousness and it creating its own dynamic, fixing its sense of being in time, must be afraid intrinsically because time ends. Because life, in fact, now is not in time. And time cannot encompass it. So it's afraid of that denial of itself which life represents. To die, to live, he says, that's why the dying to the known, to dying to time, becomes very important. And he talks about time as illusion, therefore. See what the sense of self-knowing, the sense of transformation, the quality of wholeness that he wants to bring about, does require us to face these issues in our own lives and very directly. But look how subtle they get. But that's why no phenomena is to be neglected, because each is a manifestation of that totality. It's like consciousness, you can look at it holographically. Whatever issue we look at contains in principle the whole. And they may, of course, just be a doorway to that, to a deeper level of causation. That the reason why I am envious is because I'm afraid of not being anything. And the reason why I'm afraid of not being anything is actually that I've invested my being psychologically in time. So consciousness itself, as self, the self contains the root of fear. And that keeps seeding itself through time. So the stopping of the seeding of time, the stopping of time becomes fundamental if this other dimension is to arise, which is what he's interested in. The regeneration of mankind cannot be effected in time. That's another major step. He used to jump all over the place. And it was very hard to catch up with. And he used to make this step saying the ending of time is fundamental if we're going to be whole. So he talks about time is illusion. Now, is it? He goes into that. He says, there is tomorrow, and there have been many yesterdays. Time, not in wait, chronologically apparent attention. Thought, which uses time as a means to bring about an inward change. A psychological change is pursuing a non-change. For such a change is only a modified continuity of what has been. Thought can only project from the past. Such thought is sluggish, postpones, takes shelter in the illusion of gradualness, in ideals, in time. Through time, mutation is not possible. So it's not only just change, it's mutation, which is a radical change. The very denial of time is mutation. Mutation takes place where the things which time has brought into being, habit, tradition, reform, the ideals, are denied. Deny time, and mutation has taken place. A total mutation. Not the alteration in patterns, nor the substitution of one pattern by another, which is what time does, right? Thought does. But acquiring knowledge, learning a technique, require time, which cannot and must not be denied. They are essential for existence. Time to go from here to there is not an illusion, but every other form of time is an illusion. Well, there are other forms of time. Why wouldn't time? You see, we all give ourselves time, and maybe we consider ourselves lucky that we have it. There's a tomorrow. But he used to say, is there a tomorrow psychologically? Or there is only a psychological yesterday. And therefore, there is no real future for us in terms of change. And the change that we project from time, from the past, is just its own continuity. When has change really taken place in our lives? When has there been a moment of regeneration, of real freedom? When we were struggling with something in ourselves, and suddenly we had an insight, a breakthrough that liberated us from that. Right? Fear, for example. Have we ever met it? Truly, loneliness. Have we ever really embraced that, stayed with it, allowed it to flower? Because it's all in consciousness. It's also in the body, by the way. It's also a sensation. I'm not saying it's just an idea, but it's mostly generated from thought. These are the products of thought, which of course we don't see as products of thought. So that becomes an important first step, to realize what is and what is not the product of thought. And that's hard to do. But it's part of the observation that we need to do, right? To perceive the distinction between an actual feeling of fear and the fear that's generated by thought, which pretends or passes for something independent, real. Right? Thought generates its own reality from its own memory and projects it onto the body, and because it's a sensation, we take it to be real, but it's produced by thought. Right? So we have to really understand that very well. Thought is time. It's based upon the past, and it has all these dimensions. Right? So where does change take place? When does it take place? When has it taken place for us? It was a flash, wasn't it? It was a flash of insight. It was a moment when something was instantly perceived. We didn't even know what happened, because it wasn't us in a way. This is the beauty and the mystery of it for me, that the real changes take place in moments of insight, and that insight is not something that thought does. It's something that comes from intelligence. I call it intelligence for calling something that is unknown, really. We give it names, and maybe that's dangerous also. But it's a flash of perception. That's when the looking becomes perceiving. You see, for example, into the fear of death. Imagine having an insight into the fear of death, which seems to be so overwhelming to most human beings. That's possible. That freedom from such a fundamental fear is possible. Because it's just made by the mind, by thought, which knows nothing of death. We'll never know what death means except its ending. And yet it fears it, because it fears the denial of all the projections and continuities on which it depends. The self, we depend psychologically on continuity for our own sense of worth and meaning. If we have no tomorrow, we feel completely lost. We are creatures of purpose. But do we have a tomorrow psychologically? Isn't the present moment, which is the only living time, does it have a continuity? Chronologically, Kay says it does, but psychologically he says it doesn't. Now that's what he says. There is something to look into. Why we're so dependent on the future psychologically for our sense of being, and why that very future is generating such fear in us. Without the future, there is no fear, because fear is bound to the future. Without future time, there is no fear. So there you are. The construction of the psyche is incredibly subtle, and to perceive it requires a non-separation from that movements of feeling and emotion and thought. For that insight to be released, insight is an energy that is its own perception. It's like there is no agent in the perception of insight. If you had an insight ever, you realize it's just a flash. But it's a flash of seeing. I don't know what it is really. I'm describing only a phenomenon which I find absolutely extraordinary, beautiful, liberating, and at the same time mysterious. Because if we could produce it at will, then of course we would be freer and happier, hopefully. But that cannot be produced at will. It's something that has special condition, needs a special state. If special, I hesitate to say it because otherwise it makes it a bit, strange or alien. It puts it in a kind of special position. I don't want to give it that. It's special maybe because it happens seldom. But in Krishnamurti's case, for example, my feeling is that this quality of insight was the normal state of the operation of his mind. It was part of the freedom from knowledge that he already had, which allowed this release of perception of energy that saw directly into the nature of things. That's what is so surprising about his whole teaching, that is so apparently so accurate and so factual. How can you be that factual? It's incredible. And I think it's because it has this clarity of perception. At least this is what I attribute. I'm interpreting a little bit. I'm not in his mind. But the sense of directness of perception without this deviation of interference from any other element from the past. And he could see, apparently, through this whole structure of consciousness which was there. So there's more to say about that, but I'm going to skip a little bit, because he said, what he's bringing about, of course, what we wanted to talk about a little bit, was the fact that when this perception and this freedom is there, when thought subsides in terms of being the focus of being and of our lives and of our energy, then another quality arises. You're already in a state of vacuum. You have more mental space. See, we lack space. We have a lot of time that, in a way, we're full of time, and that time is what occupies our space and narrows it, psychologically speaking. If I'm full of myself, of my past, I lack the space, the emptiness from which to look at the present. The past occupies the space which belongs to perception, and thereby denies seeing. So this is one important aspect to look at. But he said there are, he was, this is a very, very beautiful little, wait a minute, where is it? I put it in the wrong place, I think. Wait, I think I put it in the wrong place. Just a second. This is very beautiful, because K was going on a walk. See, the old boy, things happened to him in the most ordinary places. So he didn't want to make anything special about it in terms of his own person. See, he didn't want to make himself special that way. Where is it? I'm so organized, you see, that where is it? Well, I don't know where I put it. But wait, I have to find it because it is very beautiful. Aha, I found it, I think. One second. Yes. Yeah. Look how beautiful this is. He said, we were talking, and a little bit of the stream between the trees was pointed out. It was an ordinary sight, an everyday incident, but as one looked, several things took place. Not any outward incidents, but clear perception. It's absolutely necessary for maturity that there should be 1. Complete simplicity, which goes with humility, not in things or possessions, but in the quality of being. Simplicity of being. 2. Passion, with that intensity which is not merely physical, a quality of energy. 3. Beauty, not only the sensitivity to outward reality, but being sensitive to that beauty which is beyond and above thought and feeling. Beauty of that order? Have we ever really met that quality of tremendous beauty that is above thought and feeling? 4. Love, the totality of it, not the thing that knows jealousy, attachment, dependence, not that as divided into carnal and divine, the whole immensity of it. 5. And the mind that can pursue, that can penetrate without motive, without purpose, into its own immeasurable depths, that has no barrier, that is free to wander without time-space. Suddenly one was aware of all this, and all the implications involved in it. Just the mere sight of a stream between decaying branches and leaves on a rainy, dismal day. And that was really nice of him to add that little detail at the end. An ordinary thing, and in such a dismal, rainy, dismal day, he's looking at the little stream, ordinary stuff, and this insight just comes up, and he sees all this. What are the requirements for maturity, he calls it, for this quality of inward maturity? Mankind is immature. We are immature, living in time and behaving in this childish way, in this ignorant way. So to grow up means this. This is the requirements, he says, or the conditions. What is necessary, right? Complete simplicity of being. So it's not so much the house, of course, we should reduce our consumption. The UN has told us, let's follow, and all that. Be simple, but simple inside, right? Passion, not the physical thing of desire and so on only. Well, that may be there, but which is not merely physical, it's something internal. Do we have passion? Are we passionate beings or not? Is there a passion in us that comes with this simplicity, is part of the simplicity of living? Beauty? Is there this quality of beauty? Is that important also in our lives? Has it been with us? Maybe it was when we were children at certain points. We saw beauty, light, color, sound. That is sensation. But beyond that, right, to the quality, he says there's beauty beyond thought and feeling. Not beyond sensation also. A quality of inner beauty. Transcendent in terms of not being dominated by any image or concept. Love is a big word, and for him very fundamental. The totality of it, he says. When he talks about love, he always denies a lot of stuff, and he says, not the thing that knows jealousy, attachment, and dependence. So he always put those dimensions of love, which is what we know or have known in our relationships, and we have known the torture of that. So he says, actually, that ends up in a torturous place. We actually damage each other by this so-called love. So that's not love, right? Love has some other dimension. It cannot be divided into carnal and divine. We also do make that division, right? Sex is the denial of wisdom. Is it? Who said? The whole immensity of it. We don't know what that is. But he suggests this immensity. If the known is not controlling love, which is what all this dependence means, then he may have also in that other dimension of timelessness, that may be love. Love in its totality. Beauty without this reductionist conditioning of time. That's what he proposes, that there is, all these qualities exist in a much more intense and pure and authentic way, maybe in their authentic way, in this dimension when time is not dominant. And the mind that can pursue, that can penetrate without motive, without purpose, into its own immeasurable depths, that can wander freely without time and space. That mind, do we know that mind? This is where he's wondering, and that's where, I just read one last thing, otherwise we won't have much time, where this other, when it wanders beyond time and space, there is an encounter with this otherness. The other actually, if you read the notebook, you realize that Krishnamurti had a very funny relationship with the otherness. The otherness was there in the room, waiting after we came from a meeting. Or the otherness was coming, rolling up the valley like a soft curtain of rain. Or so it was. So the other, which is supposedly represents the immense, the immeasurable, has a presence, and it has also a presence in space. Right? It says it's a timeless thing, but it was 12 o'clock when he was there, right? So I find that very interesting. It's like the divine can also, come for tea. I'm not sure he's an English gentleman, but it sort of that quality of gentlemanly relation between K and the divine, if you like, the sacred. The sacred was behaving very gentlemanly. So I'm waiting in the sitting room for you. Should I apologize? I'm sorry I kept you waiting. So there's such, and yet he has, the encounters are always different, and he feels there's always the same, because there's something impenetrable, indestructible about it. The real purity of the energy from the beginning of time, from the source of creation itself that permeates all existence, is there. That for him is really the point at which regeneration is possible, because that is the creative energy itself. So the contact with it is what's the factor ultimately for him of true regeneration. And that's why mankind needs to make the point of finding it, coming in contact with it. That was his thing. He says, if we come in contact with this, if we can open the door to that, tap into that reservoir, then that energy itself, because it's pure and creative from the beginning, will inform our lives, and we have a chance, maybe, to behold ourselves and create a completely different world, free from all this destructive movement. I think if that's the way, let's go. Why don't we do it more often? You see, why doesn't the UN take this on board? Instead of trying to control the number of atomic heads. They control the heads that control the heads, But I'll read you some things. Just a couple of things from his encounter, and then I'll stop. He says, woke up early with that strong feeling of otherness, of another world that is beyond all thought. It was very intense and as clear and pure as the early morning, cloudless sky. Imagination and illusion are purged from the mind, for there is no continuance. Everything is, and it has never been before. Where there is a possibility of continuance, there is delusion. It was a clear morning, though soon clouds would be gathering. As one looked out of the window, the trees, the fields were very clear. A curious thing is happening. There is a heightening of sensitivity. Sensitivity not only to beauty, but also to all other things. The blade of grass was astonishingly green. That one blade of grass contained the whole spectrum of color. It was intense, dazzling, and such a small thing, so easy to destroy. Those trees were all of life, their height and their depth, the lines of those sweeping hills and the solitary trees were the expression of all time and space, and the mountains against the pale sky were beyond all the gods of man. It was incredible to see, feel all this by just looking out of the window. That was an extraordinary window. My window, doesn't normally reveal this much. Incredible windows he had. Probably not even double glazed. I'll read you a couple of others, just to the beauty of what he's talking about. This is something else. It's about the energy and how it pours into him. I had told you about this metaphor he had used of the polished granite stones. Woke up long before dawn, when the air is very still, and the earth waiting for the sun. Woke up with a clarity that was peculiar, and an urgency that demanded full attention. The body was completely motionless. This he says every time almost. The body was completely motionless. There was no motion in the body when he was in these states. An immobility that was without strain, without tension. And inside the head, a peculiar phenomenon was going on. A great wide river was flowing with the pressure of immense weight of water, flowing between high, polished granite rock. On each side of this great wide river was polished, sparkling granite on which nothing grew, not even a blade of grass. There was nothing but sheer polished rock, soaring up beyond measurable eyesight. The river was making its way, silently, without a whisper, indifferent, majestic. It was actually taking place. It wasn't a dream, a vision, not a symbol to be interpreted. It was there taking place, beyond any doubt. It was not a thing of imagination. No thought could possibly invent it. It was too immense and real for thought to formulate it. The immobility of the body and this great flowing river between the polished granite walls of the brain went on for an hour and a half. Well, see, he says this was no imagination. These were the polished granite walls of the brain into which this immense volume of water was being poured. Right? Now, just one last one about his meeting with the other. And we close there. This is a very nice, because you remember when the whole thing started, when the whole process began, Krishnamurti had first the experience of non-duality, of where is it? Yeah, the experience of non-duality first, of seeing the man working on the road, and then being the man, the stone, the hammer, the blade of grass, the bird. He's had that. So he has it not just then at the beginning, but it keeps happening to him. This sense of non-duality, of being one with what is, and especially with people. There is a huge, unmolested banyan tree, so this was in India, many years old, by the side of the road. It is really magnificent, huge, vital, unconcerned. And that evening it was the Lord of the hills, the earth and the streams. It had majesty, and the stars seemed very small. Along the road, a villager and his wife were walking, one behind the other. The husband led, and the wife followed. They seemed a little more prosperous than the others that one met on the road. They passed us, she never looking at us, and he looked at the far village. We caught up with her. She was a small woman, never taking her eyes off the ground. She wasn't too clean. She had a green soiled sari, and her blouse was salmon-colored and sweat-stained. She had a flower in her oily hair and was walking barefooted. Her face was dark, and there was about her a great sadness. There was a certain firmness and gaiety in her walk, which in no way touched her sadness. Each was leading its own life, independent, vital, and unrelated. But there was great sadness, and you felt it immediately. It was an irremediable sadness. There was no way out, no way to soften it, no way to bring about a change. It was there, and it would be there. She was across the road, a few feet away, and nothing could touch her. We walked side by side for a while, and presently she turned off and crossed the red riverbed of sand and went on to her village, the husband leading, never looking back, and she following. Before she turned off, a curious thing was taking place. The few feet of road between us disappeared, and with it also disappeared the two entities. There was only that woman walking in her impenetrable sadness. It was not an identification with her, nor overwhelming sympathy and affection. These were there, but they were not because of the phenomenon. Identification with another, however deep, still maintains separation and division. There are still two entities, one identifying with the other, a conscious or an unconscious process through affection or through hate. And in it there is an endeavor of some kind, subtle or open. But here there was none at all. She was the only human being that existed on that road. She was, and the other was not. It was not a fancy or an illusion. It was a simple fact, and no amount of clever reasoning and subtle explanation could alter that fact. Even when she turned off the road and was going away, the other was not on that straight road that went on. It was some time before the other found himself walking beside a long heap of broken stones, ready for renewing the road. Along the road, over the gap in the southern hills, came that otherness with such intensity and power that it was with the greatest difficulty that one could stand up and continue the walk. It was like a furious storm, but without the wind and the noise, and its intensity was overwhelming. The being with another, the being the other, the non-duality with everything is also what brings the other along. That's the feeling I get. The other is where you are not. He used to say that. When they asked him what's the essence of the teachings, he said, all right, you want it in a phrase, I'll give it to you. Where you are, the other is not. Or the other way around, right? The other is when you are not. So that is the key to his teachings, according to him. And this is where he shows when he's not there, there's the other. But he's not just the other as the other person, but the other as something immense from creation itself. Okay. I went a little long today.
Hier.
Nou, dan moet je wel wat vragen, want ik ga niks vragen.
Hello, yeah. Javier, thank you very much for your presentation.
All righty, thanks.
I get the impression that you appreciate Kay very much as a poet. Is that right?
Yes.
I hear it when you cite him. There's quite a lot of intensity and love in it when you present his text as a poet. On the other, the other impression was that some of the descriptions about the other seem a little bit childish, like in the older days we would say, God was waiting for me in my room to have tea together. And you said indeed it's a strange relationship. So I was thinking about that, how that is possible, because he is also describing the other in a much more abstract way, which is better for us, I think, as the old personalized images of the ultimate and so on. So I just want to give this reaction to what you presented. Maybe you can say something about it, or.
Well, I'm just amused by that. I find it interesting that the infinite should manifest in such concrete ways that can be localized. And so, you say it's everywhere and nowhere. Well, this one was in the living room.
Yeah.
And he was there when he only found it when he came into the room. He was doing something else somewhere else, and stepped into the room and found it there, you see. So he felt almost like apologizing, because probably the other had been waiting for him. But it's the thing that I don't know. That's his description. Or when he said things like, the other was standing in the room, but he was not really outside or inside. It was, you could localize it there, but there was no separation somehow with it. So I'm not sure what to make it. What he said, the other came rolling up the valley. I like that very much, because it depends how you imagine the other. If it is as a living being, then he was just coming around rolling, but it's probably just a form of energy. So maybe these are just is energy. It has that quality of wholeness, but it can be perceived, or he perceives it, as localized. Though in itself it has no material. He says it's also not material. I mean, at certain points, if you read through it, you realize that he says it's not material. And yet he sort of, in his description, makes it sort of available to our imagination as something very concrete, right? That appears, and that like is something other than him, and he can see it standing somewhere else, right? Coming and rolling up the valley, or he says it was waiting around the corner. It's like you go for a meeting, say, okay, I come see you at 5 o'clock. Are you there? I wait for you around the corner. I don't know how to say that. I don't know what else to say except that this was his experience.
Yeah. So it looks like he, like all of us, have the need to personalize it, to make it more concrete. Talk about the ultimate or the ground of being, it's rather abstract. But somebody waiting for you in the room is much more concrete. And that's what we need, I think.
Could be.
Although it's contrary to what we understand from the otherness. It's others, it's other. It's not that, but we need it to give it that form.
But now you bring up something in my mind, which is that haven't you had the experience of sometimes seeing energies, actual energy, which is not visible to the eye, but you see it, and it's there. There's no mistaking it. I mean, I'm not clairvoyant or anything, but a couple of times it just so happened that once at Brockwood when I was a student, I'm not saying anything other than trying to approach the mystery and what kind of manifestations arise. For example, a certain energy of compassion, which I think that is part of what he's experiencing when he sees this woman and becomes the woman and is completely lost in her sadness. Not lost, it's just feels her complete sadness. So the compassion also appeals to this energy. That's one way I have of reading it. He doesn't say that. He doesn't make that connection. The other just came later, around the corner, or whatever it was. But there is the energy of compassion. And the energy of compassion is not your energy and is not visible by the eye, is not a material phenomenon, and yet it is perceptible. A couple of times, one time at Brockwood, I had a lot of sorrow in my soul because of my background. I come from a where domestic violence was very much at home in my place. So Bohm had been talking about sorrow. So I said, well, all right, I have a lot of it. What do you do? Because they said, all right, can we be free from sorrow? So how do we approach sorrow? So Bohm had a little proposal to make, and I carried it out, which was, sorrow is there, then it's in your mind, it's in your memory, is already your experience that is in your identity. So see about bringing it up, letting it flower. You see the question of flowering, the flowering of sorrow. So go sit by yourself and bring up all the images that represent sorrow, that mean sorrow, the words, the memories, the everything. And don't protect, don't how you say, don't prevent, don't create a barrier, resistance to it. Let it be, flower. So I did that. I dare to feel and be the sorrow that was psychological, the content of my consciousness. And I was completely in it. I was crying my heart out by myself by just recalling all these things. Yes, even all I had to do was to recall the faces of my friends in the school to feel sorrow, because everyone had it. And at that moment, with my eyes closed, I saw, not me, whatever, there was a seeing of an energy that was rolling over the garden at Brockwood Park. Don't ask me what that was, what happened there, but these things, phenomena, in my opinion, exist when you come to a certain point of oneness, even with your darkest feelings. The oneness generates a freedom of energy, and that energy appeals, I think, I call it the energy of compassion. It's there. He may have called that the other, or something like that. You see, of course, that lends itself to confusion because of the general sense that the immense has no particular shape or form. So how would you do it? And yet these forms of energy are there, and they appear, and they manifest at particular instances. You see, he always felt protected, and I think the sense of protection he had, in my view, partly it's just speculation on my part, but the feeling is that this quality of energy, of compassion, was around him.
I thinking about this, and one part of what you described, we could call a catharsis.
Yes.
The process of catharsis.
Yes, of healing internally.
What you explain is another dimension.
Yeah.
Taking part in that process.
Yes. This is my feeling, that when one begins to, this is very, I think, perhaps interesting. I never made the connection, but perhaps interesting in the context of what we're talking about, that actually there is no real separation between whatever we experience and whatever feelings we have. If there is that catharsis and the energy of compassion, which belongs to another dimension, that very oneness with oneself and the healing that takes place in that non-duality is what the compassion calls on the compassion.
Yes.
Something like that. Huh?
Like that, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. And I just love the notebook, and I know that I'm going to read it every day. There's so much. So I just wanted to say that it's wonderful to know that those blessings that felt it with Kay as well. And I have to be very careful that I don't project or have illusions of that, not to make it an experience. But I just wanted to say that this talk has been really tremendous. Thank you so much, because I've been wrestling. I realize that I've been looking inward with the outward eyes. And I can't, I'm sure you know what I'm referring to in the notebook. And so that's given me, and to have that passive awareness. And, I just got to really watch my motives and tensions and such. And it's so beautiful. And even hearing Kay referring to meditation as, how did he say it? As not a, like, as it was a D word, like not delicious. But and
A delight.
Pardon me?
Probably a delight.
A delight. Yes, it was a delight. Yeah, so it's just been very beautiful. So I just want to, it's just means so much to me to hear you and to have a greater insight. So thank you so much. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Yeah.
Hi, I'll jump in here. I also really enjoyed our 3-day seminar, and found myself really thinking and just being alert, especially last night, since you were asking us how we slept. I was woken up by something, and I had a memory arise in my mind from childhood when I used to have sleep paralysis. And I used to think that there were things in the room with me, spirits. And then when I would look outside the window, I think I'd see, it's always like the form of a human being that I would see. And then I would get scared and I couldn't sleep. So I had that memory come up again as an adult, and was wondering why I was thinking that now. I thought I was over that. So then I sat down and I read the notebook. I'm only on chapter 3. It's the longest chapter. And I found myself contemplating on denial and destruction, creating space in the mind. I think that's very, very true. Like the denial of this thought that I had of whatever, like, spirits, ghosts, realizing that, my logic as an adult, realizing that's just a thought in the mind. And in the denial is the destruction too of the thought. I know I'm getting really abstract with it, but it's making sense to me to think of it with these words, because that in itself does create space, so that I don't know about the space thing. I'm not sure. So I wrote a question for us, because I did want to ask a question today. And what I wrote was, how does Kay differentiate between space and emptiness? How do we understand it? Is space and emptiness the same thing, or is it two different entities?
I think they're the same in his description, but if you feel they're different, then you have to explore the difference, because the space he's talking about is mostly inward space, right? The space of consciousness not occupied. It's like a space in a room, empty of furniture. So our minds, our consciousness are full of furniture that we put there, and our days are filled with the movement of thought in its occupations. We are self-occupied. That was one of his basic questions. You see, how come that we are so self-occupied? Is there not emptiness of this? If this self-occupation subsides, because we see maybe the futility of it, the mechanicalness, the meaninglessness of such an activity, maybe it's just promoted by fear of the emptiness itself. See, we're afraid of emptiness. And somehow we feel that in emptiness we are not. The silence denies us. But it is important, therefore, that's why we don't have space in the mind, because the occupation is what gives meaning to our lives. When we begin to see the mechanicalness of that occupation, and that it is actually hiding the real nature of our consciousness, which is to be empty, then we begin to look past it. We begin maybe to create a space, or a space begins to, not to create, begins to arise naturally from the subsiding of self-occupation. That's part of also the movement of meditation. Look at the self-occupation, allow it to flower and die. When it dies, there is space. And that's the emptiness of consciousness. I see them as the same, but maybe you're onto something. So I would, by distinguishing between them, so I would keep up with that investigation. Yeah, I see that you're onto something there. You're investigating for yourself, and that's the whole point. And in relation to your actual life and what your consciousness does, or our fears, childish visions, and so on, all that is still with us, and it has probably created certain patterns in consciousness. So we have to look at that and see whether they have any validity or not. But we have to embrace them. We have to look at them. We have to allow them to flower and have their natural end. That's the point. So that you're free and have the space to look past all these projections of consciousness.
Thank you, Javier. I guess, Julio, you can go next.
No, you keep reading and pondering and asking questions. That's the beauty of this also. Mm-hmm. It's a very free thing. There's no authority in it, and there's so many questions that will arise, right? Because he's talking already. This is after a lot of many years of having talked more generally about the human condition. He's already kind of past all that. So he's laid the ground himself in terms of his teachings. And now he's just trying to also convey something of this other dimension as best he can, of course, which is not easy. So that's why there will be lots of questions. So keep studying and seeing your life, which is the most beautiful thing. That dialogue with Kay and one's life, it can be extremely creative.
Julie Angelina, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Javier. It was wonderful. And the question I have is, you know, there's a friend of ours who
we don't hear you. There's somehow we lost your voice for a while.
Oh,
you're talking about just a friend of yours.
Yes, she couldn't attend, and she wanted me to ask you whether you host dialogues and whether you're available to participate in dialogues, and is this something that you would like to consider?
I do dialogues occasionally with I do have now participated in some online dialogues, a couple of dialogues, one with a group in the US, which is some friends who are also in this retreat, and with some people in Spain. And those have, yes, generally I've been available to do that, But it depends, of course, on the schedule and all that. I don't organize them myself just like that. It's also when people sort of have a desire to do it, and there is enough interest, then we just put a group together. So that's possible. So you can keep in touch with me about that, and we see what can be done.
Thank you.
I was actually thinking of that possibility and in collaboration as collaborating with you, Javier, to perhaps continue dialogues in some form. But anyway, these are things that we could maybe
then
look into and talk about.
Yes. Well, we did talk about dialogue, and I thought that was a potential avenue for further conversation as such. You see, when we talked to Sherida yesterday, she brought up the whole issue of collective engagement. That, I think, is one possible creative avenue of further exploration, because then we can talk, you see, as human beings from where we are at, and that's just very beautiful. This is sort of an exposition of what Kay said, and he's at such a level, but we have to start from where we are, and that's a much more humbling experience, and I think also much more compassionate in that regard, in that really we have to have the natural respect and consideration for each other as to where we are, and not just working towards or from ideals. So that's very nice. So I appreciate that very much, that possibility. So let's consider it, Ralph, and see.
Great. We'll be in touch about it. Are there any last-minute comments or questions before we close?
I have a quick comment and a question, if I can ask, if there's time. If there is time. There is a felt sense, a sort of a deep sense of wastage sometimes, and I don't want to be. I'm not very identified with it. It just comes about once in a while, and I tend to not give it too much value to it. But I want to I just want to say that, and perhaps you know what Kay always says, that relationships is so vital and so important and essential, and all life is relationship. So the wastage is really from the past, all the failed relationships that have transpired, and perhaps when he speaks what love is not, you know, I that's probably where the wastage feeling comes from, is being in those relationships, and the current relationships are sort of withering away on their own accord. So I just wanted to, that was a comment that I just wanted to make that. And something about humility, you know, you spoke about the humility as being the fundamental the fundamental virtue, and which encompasses the whole. So how does one sit in this humility? And I'm going to take this liberty in saying that there's absolutely no doubt in this mind, in this person's mind, that, you know, Krishnamurti attains this place, or this, I'm going to call it enlightenment. But some ordinary people, like some of us, you know, the word measure is coming up for me, is how does one has this measure of sitting in this humility, and I'm losing it again, sorry. Yeah, the measure in this humility, not the full extent of it, and just go from there. I mean, he spoke. You mentioned something about gift, and that he didn't like that word gift, but I'm going to take that word as a gift, that the one has to sit in humility for this gift to come, in a sense that that one can, and it comes in a measure. And the last thing that I wanted to speak about is when you said something about the observer in the non-dual existence. The observer is not the perceiver. The perceiving is no longer perceiving. So I just want to get a little sense of that. Yeah, thank you.
That's a whole.
I'm sorry, it's
no,
the mind
no,
is just the mind is racing here.
but you see, what you're sharing, as I receive it, is the kind of fundamental existential questions that we really live with. Look, the question of relationship is so vast, huh? And the feeling of waste, right? The kind of ruins of love that have been left in the wake of our experience, the hurts that remain, the regrets, the guilts, the continuous turning around of that past as an ongoing sense of bitterness, anger, and regret. I mean, look, hey, we're talking about what as human beings we end up experiencing. It's not just you, see? It's me. It's whoever has actually gone through that same level of pain and disappointment and so on. So to look into that, you see, us, just as human beings, from the factualness of that feeling, it may contain some misconceptions also. So we have to go. See, like what Kay, with the example of envy, the sense of pain and wastefulness may be the outer shell of a deeper meaning in our consciousness. Like the waste, was it a waste? What does it show about us? What does it show about our escape from ourselves, our loneliness, the deeper encounter with the nothingness below the surface movement of consciousness? Is there such a possibility? And then the humility comes in there. If you like, I am still regretting and so on, partly because of my sense of self that holds on to a certain value in relation to that past, and that I did not deserve what I got, or whatever it is I'm fighting against. The self is still fighting with his own shadow. There's a lot of shadow boxing going on in human consciousness, and we don't see that the boxer is his shadow, the shadow is boxing against. We're still split in our consciousness in relation to our own past. So to just face that simple fact, and therefore the arrogance that persists in us, the vanity, the need for self-assertion that is so pervasive. See, humility is actually the negative way. I find it always perhaps more insightful. That humility, as Krishnamurti would say, you cannot cultivate it, but it arises naturally when I perceive my arrogance, my self-assertiveness, that demand of the ego to insist on its own interests. The movement of self-occupation of consciousness that we were discussing, referring to earlier, is that movement of arrogance itself. Because it's self-assertion, even in the movement of thought itself, there is that need to perpetuate the sense of self. Whereas humility means that space in the mind where the self is not. That's why humility is the foundation of the order of meditation, because that's the denial of self. Denial in not just mental denial or assertive denial, but is actually the real denial, the non-being of self. So you see, you're asking, you mentioned such fundamental questions, you see. Of course, we can't go into them delicately as they deserve. Yes, that's why you would have to have an opportunity also for you to express yourself. See, that's what dialogue potentially could afford. You see, we seldom listen to one another to a full extent, and everybody has such a human story to tell. So it's important also to be able to feel that you can open your heart and share with others the meaning of your life as you have lived it. Not as a show, not as a show off, not as a kind of exhibitionism. We're not doing that, but just to contact and touch the very living life wire, life nerve of our existence. So that to me seems to be one of the most beautiful aspects, potential aspects that of dialogue. That you can do that, and you can then feel that you can even yourself get to hear your own story, because we are so confined in our own particular little corners that our hearts are just bottled up. There's not even the possibility to release them unless we are sort of allowing that kind of flowering in meditation, which is another way of release. You see, there's now the possibility of doing it by yourself also in that meditation that we were describing earlier, of the flowering of this emotional thing. So that may be one way thing for you to experiment with or venture into, if it's not too painful, to sort of bring up this sense of the waste of life. See, Krishnamurti used to say this thing, are we wasting our lives? And that's a genuine question for all of us. In terms of, in the way he put life and the meaning of it, if we're staying at the surface level, for him that was a waste. So it was not only just the experiences we've had and the fact that they were painful and that there was a lot of ruin left in our wake, and hurt and all that, but that the operation that consciousness itself is doing at the level at which we're living is itself also a waste. You see how far it goes. So it's not personal. It's not a question of self-pity. It's a question of considering. You see your question, personal as it is also universal in nature. Behind your experience lies that universal question as to whether human life as we live it is really meaningful. See, so your life is my life, is everybody's life, and that itself is already a sense of, for me at any rate, a sense of communion with you, with the other. Therefore, there's no other, right? I haven't disappeared yet, like Kay would disappear. But it's a beginning. It's a sense of the communion and the compassion that the awareness of the suffering of another naturally brings about. We have to be sensitive that way and give each other that freedom.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all of you for staying on a bit longer than we had intended. But it's been a wonderful workshop. Thank you so much for Javier for sharing, for your sharings and insights and the fact that you had a prolonged contact with Krishnamurti at Brockwood and so on has been also very helpful in communicating some of the experiences you had there or conversations.
Well, I hope it has been. I hope it has been somewhat inspiring and so on. Krishnamurti used to tell us when he was at Brockwood and he sat with us. He said, "Look, there was a Spanish artist, Goya. He was called. He knew about this through his friend Aldous Huxley, and he said he put under one of his paintings in Spanish, "Aún aprendo. I'm still learning." And he said to us, "That's the way to live." So I've been doing my best to continue to learn. So,
well, it's been great, and yeah, I think you've communicated well. You know, the passion and the passion that is needed for learning and the importance of it in our daily life and what all this means for us in our daily lives. If if anybody has any last questions, I think you would be probably open to answering them if somebody sends me an email about it, and I'll be glad to forward it. Otherwise, I'd encourage you to stay in contact with our center if you haven't yet signed up for our newsletters, to stay in touch with other events that we hold, and hopefully also with Javier again in the near future. So thank you very much again, all of you. I'll send out the recording of the last session. And Javier, you had mentioned the possibility of a small handout of some kind. Is this still is this still possible, or not?
I'm afraid not. Look, I always tend to say I want to say yes.
Okay.
To everything that is asked of me, but I'm afraid in this case I have not had the chance to put anything in writing. I've done basically this. I prepared for these presentations a fair amount because I didn't want to give an incoherent, rambling presentations, but I did not write anything down. I sort of more or less organized it a little bit in my head so that it's more or less coherent. So that is a pending task. I do find that the topics we touched on are really very beautiful and worthy of exploring much more broadly. And maybe I hold still for myself the possibility that maybe if I have the chance in the near future, I might write something. If I do work on this, the topics that we worked on, that we touched on in this retreat, this workshop, I will therefore send them to you, Ralph, and you will have the emails of everybody else, and you can send them to them.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
But I cannot promise anything right now because I'm a bit stuck for time, so I will have to wait a little bit. But I would gladly want to do it, but I can't promise.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be happy to forward anything if and when.
If and when
it feels right for you. So thanks very much again, everyone. Great to have you all with us, and keep well and keep learning.
Yeah, learning. All right. Ciao. Be well.
Take care, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.